Okay, welcome back. So what took place in the kind of the moment, the semi-moment between the last slide and this slide is I did my textual analysis of Dead Man's Path by Achebe. And I didn't look for everything. Mostly what I was looking for were features like the way Achebe plots the story and his use of narration, and a little bit of imagery. And I came up with some stuff that I noticed, right? So, and if this was a literature class, I would be teaching you things like how to look for plot structure and how to think about narrative point of view and how to think about imagery, and then also things like metaphors and sound effects and all kinds of other very particular literary features. And as I said, I think a second ago, every discipline is going to have, they're going to think about the kinds of conventions for the cultural objects they're dealing with, whether that's nonfiction, primary sources, visual objects, art, other kinds of art objects, sort of like spatial objects, whatever, and trying to get you to think about the history of those objects and the kinds of conventions associated with them so that you know what features to kind of look out for. So in a short story, and I'm sure you know this from high school, like the features of plot structure and narrative point of view and imagery are just like key features, right? So those are the kinds of things that I've looked for. So what did I come up with between the two slides? So first thing, I sort of looked at the difference between the basic story, i.e., what I think Dead Man's Path is about, and I looked at the difference between that and what actually happens in the plot, i.e., like how does Achebe build this story via like particular actions, right? So I noticed that there's a difference, right? Like, because the story is about Michael Obi's plans for Ndume Central School. But if you look at the plot, you realize that actually Dead Man's Path only has one little tiny paragraph, and it's really only one sentence that summarizes the changes implemented in the school. It doesn't really even tell you what the changes are, except that there is some stuff about the gardens, right? And how the gardens are now very beautiful. Right, so there's like absolutely no discussion of classroom activity at all. And that is odd, right? That's an odd thing. And it's always a good thing to find stuff that's troubling or doesn't make a lot of sense, because you can use that as evidence of something else. Okay, so the next thing I noticed is that in terms of narrative point of view, the perspective in the story is limited mostly to Michael, right? So we see things through Michael's perspective, but there's also quite a bit of emphasis on Nancy, his wife, and her perspective, especially in terms of, what her goals are with the garden and so what she wants out of this. And I thought, well, that's odd, right? Because this story is about Michael, right? He's the protagonist. He's our central character. So why does Achebe include in this like really, really short little story all of this information about Nancy's perspective as well? I thought, that's an interesting thing that I could make use of in my argument. Okay, so then some other things that I noticed when I, started looking at, once I realized, there's stuff in this story that really isn't about classroom activity. So what is it? Well, I noticed that there's a kind of a large chunky paragraph on page 10 about Nancy's desire to be admired, right, by the other wives. And I thought that's a very kind of interesting indirect way that Achebe thinks about, the goals of these characters, their motivations. And it's interesting that it's Nancy, not Michael, but so I noticed that. I noticed that Michael is really concerned about the visit from the government education officer, and we hear that on page 11, like that he wants to be evaluated, right? He really cares about what other people think of him, and very specific other people, right? Like these sort of higher ups in the education system. While on the other hand, or maybe not on the other hand, maybe it's very similar. When the village priest comes to talk to Michael about the path and why it's a really bad idea to block it off, he acknowledges that the villagers want that path open because they hold those beliefs based on the practices of our fathers, right? Like, it's not like because these are true and whatever. It's like because this is a legacy. Like, we believe this because, or the villagers believe this because their fathers before them believed that. And that's an interesting sort of hierarchy. Maybe that's that you can compare that to Michael's desire to be admired by the government education officer, right? So I'm starting to, like, as I'm doing my close reading, I'm like, ooh, neat, patterns. I can do something with that. And that's why the close reading stage is really, really important, because you won't be able to do that intellectual work of sort of breaking things apart and finding connections and patterns and noticing things if you like start writing, right? If you try to have an argument before you've done your reading. Okay, next I noticed that in terms of the plot structure, the climax, which is the turning point of the story, which you would learn in my lecture class, that's Michael's decision not to open the path. So the priest comes, says, you got to open the path, and he's like, not going to do it. But he's very, on page 12, he's very, Michael's is kind of accommodating. He says, like, we'll build you another path. I'll get the boys from the school to build you another path. But it's still a decision that he makes. And after that is what we would consider the falling action of the story, which is defined as, the outcome of the climax, like the outcome of that decision that Michael makes. And so what happens next is that a woman in the village dies in childbirth, and then the villagers destroy the school compound. Now, what's interesting there is that the way the story is written, the way it's plotted, it really does suggest a cause and effect thing, right? That Michael made a decision not to open the path, and then a woman died in childbirth. But are those things really logically related? Or is Achebe trying to do something there in terms of suggesting how we interpret events and how we make sense of them? So I thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition, because those are not, like, they don't logically follow. And yet, as we can tell by the destruction of the school compound, the villagers interpret the woman's death in childbirth as like Michael's fault, right? So there's something really interesting there about interpretation. And finally, the denouement, which is like the tying up of the story, it was very interesting to me that now all of a sudden we get the perspective of the white supervisor, right? We're like completely out of, we don't hear what did Michael go to talk to the village priest again? Did he talk to his wife? Like, we don't hear about that. All of a sudden we're like, whoop, we're a level up, and we have this story of the white supervisor's report, which criticizes Michael Obi's misguided zeal. And that was really interesting too, because that's another version of this kind of, the white supervisor shows up, it's a total mess, and he interprets what he sees in order to produce a report, right? So this is all close reading of this short story. And the key point here, first of all, I wanted to sort of explain my data points that I'm going to make use of when I build my argument, but show you how much detail you need. And when you're doing close readings, you're getting as much data as possible, and spend a good amount of time doing it. And some stuff you'll use and some stuff you won't use, right? And that's okay. Okay, so now we're going to move to the next step, which is taking this stuff, right, all of this data, and how to organize it and make use of it so that I can come up with a compelling argument. Okay, all right. Hi, okay, so now we have our data set, right? Like, now we have a whole bunch of stuff that we've noticed in this text, and we're gonna use that stuff to help us come up with and articulate an argument. And a really simple argumentative structure, right, this is not just for literature, this is for reading of a whole variety of objects across disciplines, is that a basic argumentative structure is you're gonna say, these particular features, these things that I've noticed, right, these data points show that the text is trying to articulate this theme, this position, this idea. Okay, it's a really, really basic argumentative structure. And theme within that, right, the idea, theme is not just a topic. So sometimes in high school, I think that there's this idea that, like, there's like the theme of love, right, or the theme of women. That's my favorite one. And those are not themes, those are subjects, those are topics, right? Like a theme is an attitude towards the topic or an idea, right? So if the topic is love, a theme could be like that love doesn't last, or that love is more important than money, or that love is a fantasy, a fiction, whatever. Right? And so those are all themes. Those are all, you know, different ways of thinking about love, which is why love in and of itself is not a theme. It's just a topic, right? And so again, a very, very like really basic argumentative structures say like these features help the text articulate this theme. And if it's, you know, not a literary thing and you're not sure about using theme, then you can use, you know, this position, this idea, right? This set of principles or whatever, okay? But for literature, for sure, theme is like a totally relevant phrase or word term. Okay, so what I've got here are 3 different, and I got to be really careful because sometimes when I touch the screen, it does weird things. 3 different arguments for based on making use of the data set, right? Because I wanted to show that your data set can like go in a number of different directions. And these arguments don't necessarily contradict one another. They're not counter arguments, but they're just different ways of making use of the evidence in order to focus on different themes, okay? So number 1 is that the analysis of such formal features as narrative, plotting, and imagery. So that's where I, like you see, I've color coded it here. So in bold, it's like these are the features that I'm going to be looking at, right? So that's the narrative, plotting, and imagery. They reveal, right? There's my active verb there. They show how Dead Man's Path, my cultural object, critiques, that's my attitude, critiques the desire to seek admiration. So together, critiquing the desire to seek admiration is the theme that I'm saying all of these features show. Okay, so that's one argument. Another possible argument is that analysis of such formal features as narrative and plotting show that Dead Man's Path challenges the idea that rules are objective, representing how rules are often imposed by those who seek to gain or retain power. Because I thought, you know what, the use of the white supervisor, he's the government education officer, and even Michael himself, like there's a really interesting sort of power commentary on power structures going on in this story, right? And I think that the evidence shows that. Now I wanted to draw your attention to here, like look at how long that idea is, right? It's really long. You don't, I think there's this weird thing in high school where like try to sum up your argument in as few words as possible. Like your thesis should be really, really short, and you just have to forget that. If that was ever, you know, a piece of advice that you got, just forget it. You take as long as you need to fully articulate what you think the important idea or theme is in the text that you think the evidence supports, okay? All right, my third possible thesis statement is that in Dead Man's Path, formal features such as plot structure and narrative point of view are used to challenge the notion that there is only one truth, and also to assert that ideas or stories will be interpreted to suit the needs of the group. So what I wanted to show you in this version was that like I have a 2-part argument, right? I'm going to argue this thing, and then I'm going to argue this other thing as well. So I think that there's 2 interrelated themes that my evidence can support, right? So you can play with this idea of making up a thesis statement, like you're not locked in. And in fact, one of the things I think you should get used to in university is taking the time to articulate sophisticated positions, right? Don't try to sum things up into like just a few words, because you probably won't have enough to say to sustain an entire paper, right? So take your time. And I wanted to show that all of these arguments are totally possible. They're viable based on the evidence, right? So it's not this idea that there's only one way, there's only one argument that can emerge out of a close reading. There's like tons and tons and tons and tons, depending on what evidence you can pull out of the text, right? And depending on the kinds of themes that you're interested in, right? And the way you're doing your reading, okay? So it's actually creative. It's not like just because I'm saying opinion doesn't matter, a lot of you will be in your argument as well, because you, in your close reading, you will see certain things that somebody else will not see, okay? All right, so in the next slide, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to talk a little bit more on how to build this argument. I'm going to choose one of these arguments. Build an argument through the essay, because that's like another difference between what I think is a sophisticated essay and a kind of very basic essay, okay?